Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Andrea Pisauro, Joint Coordinator for Europe for Scotland, and I am with Nina Yatte.
Yeah, hello. I'm also a coordinator for Europe for Scotland. And normally we are having these events on days that are big anniversaries for Scotland. We had one of those anniversaries recently. We were planning to have the event then, but we had to postpone the 10-year anniversary of the independence referendum in 2014. But today is actually another anniversary for Germany, where I'm from. It is German Unity Day, 34 years.
When was that?
Do you want to talk a little bit about this photo, Annie, first, maybe?
Oh, yeah, we can talk about the photo, but just remind us, when was the year?
1990. So 1989, the wall came down in November. So that's going to be next month, the 35th anniversary of that happening. And yeah, so then on the 3rd of October in 1990, the two Germanys became, like East Germany and West Germany, the GDR and West Germany became one again, reunited. So Germany is actually such a young nation, unlike Scotland.
Well, yeah, so in 1990, Germany was the youngest nation in Europe.
Mm.
And who knows, we hope soon, Scotland might be the youngest nation in Europe again, because Scotland is probably one of the first nations in Europe to be born many centuries ago. But let's talk about this picture for a minute. So this was the day after a sad day for Scotland, the Supreme Court judgment that ruled that an independence referendum cannot be organized by the Scottish government alone. And there were a bunch of rally of solidarity that we, as a Europe for Scotland, organized across Europe. And this is the one in Germany. It was one of the coldest days of the year. There is a lot of wind. And this brave activist, you can see Felix Hoffmann smiling at you there. If he's following us, hi, Felix. Were braving the element to express their solidarity with Scotland, reading a statement in German, same statement that was read in many other European languages, in many other European capitals. And of course, we want to start from this because European history is important to us. The Berlin Wall is not far from the Brandenburg Arch that you see there. And democracy is important to us. That day, democracy was denied to Scotland, but 2024 is a very important and historic year for democracy, because we need to keep this in mind. The world is in a very difficult situation. There are tragic wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, but it was also a year in which the largest number of human beings were allowed to vote in an election. And this is important because, democracy is advancing overall. It's a risk in many countries, but it's good that so many people were voting. And crucially, I think for Scotland and for Europe, this is the first time in history that on the same year, EU, US, and UK elections are happening and taking place in the same year. So it's a significant year in which a lot of things have been changing. And we want to cover a bit of what this means for Scotland. And we'll focus mostly on these three elections, because obviously the European elections in June were very important. Europe is changing, and we can discuss how and what it means for Scotland in terms of the enlargement process that is starting. But then, of course, today is not just the day of the anniversary of German unification. It's also a month before the US presidential election. And we are also a few months, 100 days after, more or less, the UK general election, which were in many ways historical. So we have two fantastic guests with whom we will discuss these elections together. We'll start talking about the UK general election, and then we will move on to the US presidential election. So I'll start by introducing them. So Yeah, sorry, Nina.
I just wanted to say you are going to present the first half of the show, and I will probably say bye now because I returned for the part about the American election.
Indeed. See you later, Nina. And I'll start by introducing our guest today. So we are very happy to have with us Kirsty Hughes, who is a writer, a researcher, a commentator on European, Scottish, and UK politics. She writes, hello, Kirsty.
Hello.
You write a beautiful blog on Substack that is about Europe and Scotland. So obviously for our campaign, it's quite crucial to follow your updates. You also directed and founded the Scottish Centre on European Relations. So you're an expert on everything that is EU related. You even worked for the European Commission for a couple of years and publish extensively about the topic. So thank you very much for joining us. Where are you joining us from, Kirsty?
I'm joining you from Edinburgh, and thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. We always love to come to Edinburgh whenever we can. I also want to introduce our other guest, who many of you will know, Anthony Barnett, the founding editor of Open Democracy, one of UK leading intellectual and political commentators, and our very own co-founder. Hi, Anthony. Where are you joining us from?
Hi. I'm here out in Botley in West Oxford.
Fantastic. So from Oxford to Edinburgh, I am in Plymouth, so we cover a good triangle within the UK. It's lovely to have you with us. Before starting our conversation, our idea was to start off with a couple of slides about the UK general election, because there are a few points we want to highlight, which from the perspective of our campaign were quite remarkable. And I think they speak about the historic nature of this election. So if the first slide could be put up, that's our first message. So I think across Europe, I must say, there was a sense of relief that the Tories are gone because of what we witnessed over the last few years, from Brexit, to the pandemic, to Boris Johnson, the scandals. Everyone has seen in Europe what a mess the Tories have made. But from our perspective, this general election was also about how UK democracy remains utterly dysfunctional. And we want to show you some data that prove this point. So if we can go to the next slide. I think you're all familiar with the first past the post-electoral system. And we can see from this slide that the enormous discrepancy that there is between the vote share of the Labour Party and its share of seats is almost double. So for the same number of people, there is double the number of seats in terms of parliamentary representation. And this is not, I mean, it's always like that with the UK first past the post, but this year was particularly bad. If you go to the next slide, we can have a look at the gap between vote share and seats across election from 1920s. And you can see here on the right, the latest bar is the largest gap between vote share and seats. Never before in history was the gap so large. So that speaks about the dysfunctionality of the system, how much the popular will is changed from when people put the vote in the ballot to when the seats are elected. And if we go to the next slide, we can also see a few other things. So this is the number of votes for the winning party or coalition of parties. And you can see where the last general election sits is the latest red bar. And you can see that only 2 times in history, there was a lower amount of votes gathered by the party winning the election. This was in 2005, which was an election during the Iraq War, where the Labour government was particularly unpopular. And then we need to go back to 1929, which was the first election with universal suffrage, where, of course, the population of the UK was much lower. So it's not a fair comparison because there were much fewer people then. And, you know, the number of votes Starmer now is about similar in size. And if you go to the next slide, we can make a somewhat deeper point. This is the percentage share of votes on the party that wins the election. And if you look at the percentage, this is indeed the government in the history of UK democracy with the weakest popular mandate. So it's quite a remarkable weakness of the current government, and this is even before talking about what happened in the last 100 days. And the very last slide, it's about Keir Starmer. So this is the swing in the constituency of the new prime ministers that succeeded in 10 Downing Street, starting from Ramsay MacDonald in 1929. So it's a political tradition in the UK that the new prime minister increase his share of votes in his own constituency, which is a sign of trust and encouragement from the local constituency to the guy that is about to assume power. And you can see that most new prime minister increase the share of votes. There is only one exception, which is Theresa May, although she was already prime minister at the time of the 2017 election, but she only lost about 1%. And Luca Starmer, minus 17%. This speaks about a dip in popularity locally. And this is historic in terms of UK election history. So I think that gives you the idea that in this election there was something peculiar going on. And I want to start precisely from this, asking Kirsty what she thinks about this general election, and also what she thinks about what happened in the 100 years that followed that, because we heard a lot about this European reset of Starmer, who was in Brussels just yesterday, actually. And so what do you think about this reset? Do we need to believe that there is a reset going on?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And those are great slides. And I also really appreciate you talking about democracy and German Unity Day, which reminded me that actually I was lucky enough to live in Berlin for 2 years from September 1989, which was probably one of the main reasons I ended up becoming an expert on EU enlargement during the 1990s. And of course, that was in so many ways a great democratic change. I think, as you said, and I think before we air all our criticisms, I think I'm just going to repeat what you said at the start, that of course, so many people welcomed the Tories losing the election and leaving government. And it was clear, if you add up all the centre to centre left or Green or Social Democrat votes, if you like, that there was a clear majority if we had a proportional representation system for a change and away, not only from the really quite or extreme right-wing policies of the Tory government, but of their style of government, which had become increasingly populist, dishonest, if not in some cases corrupt, or certainly based on lies. And the number of prime ministers we saw, Tory prime ministers, through the Brexit years, and the damage to the UK's reputation internationally, but especially in the European Union, and so many people down the years since the 2016 vote saying to me, how could the UK or how could England and Wales vote for so much damage to themselves? So that was very welcome. And I think, we're almost at the 100 days, the new Labour government's first 100 days. And it is both disappointing and in a way it's very perplexing. So if you remember the first hours and that first week, and Starmer did his speech in Downing Street wanting to bring trust and hope, and he wanted everyone to join in his national mission. Now, I'm a Democrat, and so I don't necessarily want to join in national missions, because of course there's different points of view and different ways of doing things, and he wants to make Brexit work, which I'm sure we'll talk about a fair bit tonight, and I want to reverse Brexit. So I wasn't going to be part of his national mission, but I didn't expect that by almost the 100 days anniversary, he would have become so much more unpopular, and that he would be saying he didn't mind being unpopular because, he knew what had to be done. But you don't engage people in a national mission of renewal if you're very unpopular and you don't boost hope and trust. And of course, I was trying to think before I list some of the negatives that have happened since the start of July, of some of the positives. So there was a change around onshore wind farms. The Rwanda scheme was dropped. He came to Scotland very rapidly, and John Swinney met him, and both of them said, however sincerely or not, that they wanted to work together. I say sincerely or not because, crucially, we've got Scottish elections to the Scottish Parliament in May 2026. But then it all basically went wrong, didn't it? So they very early on made that extraordinary cut in the pensioners' winter fuel payment. And they started talking about the extra missing 20 billion that the Tories had created, which may well be true. But of course, Labour came in tying its hands behind its backs with its own fiscal constraints. And if they were going to make, as they have done, the budget the centerpiece of where they're going next, why are they waiting till the end of October, which is even outside that 100 days? And this extraordinary gloom and doom mantra they've presented, I think some misleading idea that if they blame it all on the Tories for enough months, that will help them in 5 years' time to get elected again. I would say the opposite. So on the whole, it's very disappointing. It's also very puzzling. I can't imagine how you could have been ahead in the polls for so long and not have got a plan for what you want your first 100 days to achieve. I do welcome the reset in EU relations. I assume we'll say more about this. I'm going to stop talking in a second and let Anthony come into the conversation. It was great to see Keir Starmer in, I think, the second week chair the European Political Community Summit at Blenheim, to see him talk to all the EU leaders, and without the EU leaders shaking hands with Boris Johnson, who was so rude to them, the architect of Brexit, and so on and so forth. All that's great. What he seems to aim to do, what we saw from his visit to Brussels yesterday, is it looks extremely minimalist. He's adopted most of Boris Johnson's red lines. So that's not a great reset moment. If he was ever going to be brave about the EU, surely it would be at the start when he's got 5 years to go. So that's not surprising, but disappointing. And now we're waiting for apparently a very difficult budget. And the last thing I'd say, just what I think of it, in France, you've got lots of political problems. You've got Michel Barnier as the new prime minister there, centre-right. And we'll see how long and how that government manages. But he came in and said, we need to tax the wealthy more, and maybe we'll see that here at the end of October. I hope so. But here they hit the pensioners first. And that's really bad contrast, isn't it?
Completely right, Kirsty. I completely agree with everything you said. I think I want to start off picking on a point that you made, that within the narrative of Starmer, there is this idea of making Brexit work. And I am going to put it to Anthony. Is it possible to make Brexit work and have a European reset? Because you wrote a very eloquent article entitled, What's Starmer's Story? So which of these two? What's the Starmer story?
Well, thank you. And I agree with lots of what Kirsty said, so I won't try to repeat it. I want to just make one point that comes from your very striking graphs that you showed at the beginning, to emphasize one aspect of it, which is that the Labour majority was an absolutely enormous historic majority, but the absolute Labour vote, although it was 33 of those who voted, was only 20% of the electorate, because there was a high degree of abstention. And probably only about 16% of those who'd be qualified for the electorate, because there's a whole section of the population that aren't even registered, although they would be qualified to do so. So, the amount of support that they have across the UK, and especially across England, they've got a rise in support in Scotland, is astonishingly low. and the absolute majority they've got is enormously high because of the way in which the opposition to them has divided. And that happened, as your graphs show, to actually with Blair in 2005. In 2005, it's striking that Blair got a minority of the popular vote in England. And that was a sort of forerunner, was a warning that Brexit was coming. Something was dysfunctional, deeply dysfunctional in the system. When nobody bothered really to report on this, whereas I think there's a very wide sense that there's something illegitimate about the government and the way and the size of its majority and the power that it is capable of exercising. And the second thing, just to reinforce, I mean, Kirsty's been very generous in saying it's puzzling what's happened. I think it's staggering. I mean, you know, I always felt that the Starmer project was doomed. And I'll just say why at the moment. But I also felt he was a very experienced administrator. And the degree of incompetence, I mean, Frockgate, you know, because there was an election going on, I took £10,000 from somebody to buy my wife's dresses. I mean, nobody with any sense at all with what's going on. That doesn't sound right. This is a wealthy man. He doesn't need to buy it. You know, just and the number of those sorts of mistakes that are being made, the administrative mistakes, squabbles breaking out, the Diane Abbott disaster beforehand was in a way a warning that this would be coming, because the moment it became clear that there was an attempt to purge her, he should have just shut it down. I mean, you may not remember in the run-up to the election, here's first black woman MP, you know, and he should have, you know, this row went on about is she qualified, will she? Went on for weeks, and she should have just resolved it. And you thought that was really odd, and I thought it was exceptional. But it seems to me that there's something quite deeply incompetent about him, and therefore I will say he's not going to last. I cannot see how he can last 5 years if he's going on like this. And I don't see how he changes. And the reason I don't see how he changes, and this is the point about Brexit, is that the article which you kindly referred to came out of the New Statesman, because the New Statesman ran a piece by its editor saying, coming out of the riot, saying, what is the story you're telling us? Right? What you got to tell you? It's all right, you know, it's cracking down on the rioters, but they're saying we want our country back. You know, the English, or so the English thugs. Well, you know, what's your answer? And this repeated a very good essay that Jason Cowley, the editor of Statesman, had written in the Sunday Times immediately after it. Said, you're going to tell us what the story is. You've listened to your speech outside Downing Street. This is a country not comfortable with itself. What's your story? And my point was, actually, I think very deeply and fundamentally, Starmer has a project, or the people that are around him, and they've thought about it, and that is to make Brexit work. And it's so implausible a project that none of us think he can really mean that, because obviously Brexit is a process that can't work. Brexit is a failure, and Brexit is going to continue failing until we reverse it. And Kirsty, in her blog that you mentioned, talked about his rather nice phrase, softly hard Brexit, meaning he, you know, doing it gradually, but underneath it all, when you come down to it, it's a hard Brexit. And I don't think, we all talk about it, well, it's an accidentally, can't really mean it wasn't in favor of, he's one of us, he's not really. Actually, that they've taken a deep decision. And I think we have to ask why. Why would they do this? And my feeling is, in one sense, they're right. And that is that we can't reverse Brexit, in that we can't go back to how it was. I don't think that Great Britain, with all of the opt-outs that it had and not being part of the European currency, we can't return to that privileged position that we were in. Europe won't allow that. We were in it for transactional reasons. All of the prime ministers, they loved the United States. When people talk about the American alliance, special relationship. We're defending democracy. And when they talk about being in the EU, it's, well, it's necessary economically, it's transactional. We're implicitly saying it's a great pity we have to be part of this project, but, you know, and that European net wants back. So if you want to return to Europe, actually, you have to change in a more profound way than just carrying on. And so I think that what Starmer is doing is he's trying to abolish all the incompetence, the lies, the corruption, the disgusting nature of the conservative rule, which we're all just absolutely delighted to see an end to. But really, he's trying to deliver in a clean, well-organized fashion, which it appears that he's not capable of delivering even that, what they were doing as well. He wants to make Brexit work, and that's that. He's trying to. And the point, and my final point I would make here is the danger for this is that the phrase I like to use is that the status quo is the greatest danger that we have. This is true environmentally, it's true in terms of the world order, and it's also true in terms of this country. The British state is dysfunctional. The great British state is not, you know, that is the source of the danger and is not going to be the source of any solutions. And so they're committed in a profound conservative way to keeping the show on the road. And the danger here, so this is the last point I would make, is that, and some Tories, brighter Tories, have already articulated this, is we're in a repeat of 1974. Most of you will not be old enough to remember 1974, but I remember 1974 quite well, which was that a conservative government which had lost its way with the miners' strike with Heath collapsed, and a Labour government came in that basically didn't really know what to do and just wanted to keep things going. And in the 5 years that followed, the Tories rethought what conservatism was, and Thatcherism emerged from that. And they are now looking for initiating a process which will be even more right-wing than Thatcher's, even more anti-European. There's no evidence that they're going to rethink Brexit, and which would be the intelligent thing for a Tory to do at this point. Can
I just come in, Anthony,
yeah.
on that point? Because I think, you know, I agree. Well, I agree with you up to a point on the idea that Britain, as it is, can't rejoin the EU. But also, I would add what you're talking about now, which is that unless the Conservative Party shifted back to the centre-right party, even, you know, under Thatcherism, that was in favour of staying in the EU, albeit as more an economic business project than as a political project. Now, if the rest of the situation was okay, that Starmer and, you know, we've seen the Lib Dems who could have talked much more about Europe, but of course they were trying to get Tory voters. So we've seen that mixture of how they read the current politics of the UK, but also catching votes. And that's what we see Starmer doing with this adoption of Boris Johnson and Theresa May's red lines and this endless mantra on no free movement, no customs union, no single market. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, if you were trying to actually tackle some of the downsides of Brexit without rejoining, you would explore behind the scenes, is there a way to join the EU's customs union and have a say in trade negotiations? Now, I mean, the instant reaction to that is cherry picking, but Britain, you know, is a big trading partner of the EU, still a big economy in the world. And I'll just add one more thing there. I met Keir Starmer, can't remember exactly when, 2 or 3 years ago, perhaps slightly longer. He'd been traveling around the UK after a couple of years or more after the Brexit vote. And what he said to me was that he was so marked, not impressed, but you know, he really noted the divisions in the UK, and he was really worried about those divisions. So I actually think, apart from getting the vote of the Red Wall and previous Tory voters and Leave voters, there is a genuine bit there where he's decided, and I think it's illogical, but he's decided that overcoming Brexit divisions means carrying on with Brexit, even when a majority in the polls are against. He's kind of got that idea into his head, and then his political advisors presumably reinforce that because it fits with trying to keep Tory English voters on board.
I think we're getting somewhere here, because I can pick up on two of the things you say that I think are quite interesting. Because Euchers just said, why doesn't he say, we want to rejoin the customs union and get a say? Which is, by the way, more or less the position that Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn had a few years ago. More or less. I mean, I don't want to get into the specifics, but it was less than, we are more Europhile than Boris Johnson for sure. And I agree with you, Starmer is more on Boris Johnson red lines. Now, you would argue that rejoining at least the customs union in some form could be a way to make Brexit work, a better way than the one that is currently pursuing. And he doesn't want to follow that way. So do we need to trust this prime minister? Because at some point we have a person that is clearly, he voted Remain. He was a Europhile. He was opposing a lot of the red lines that he's now supporting. It's also worth reminding us that, you mentioned that before. He abolished the Rwanda deal, and then he goes to Italy to praise the Albania deal of Giorgia Meloni.
Exactly.
He wants to get the softer, hard Brexit slowly, but he wants to make Brexit work, and he says that. So can we trust Starmer? And I think this is not a trivial question, because it's also an important point from the EU standpoint, because if we cannot trust Starmer, can the EU trust Starmer? Because trust is a very important component in making Brexit a bit better. But what do you think about that? Yeah.
I think it's about, yes, I agree with the point you're making. And I think it's about the quality of our democracy, because, of course, as Anthony was saying, Starmer's trying to do this in a more professional, non-corrupt way, and he's not doing terribly well so far, but it's certainly so expensive scandal, but he's certainly not told as many lies as Boris Johnson. But he says he wants to level with us on the 20 billion black hole. He wants to tell us how it is rather than be popular. But he doesn't tell us the truth on Brexit. He doesn't say it's really damaging, but I think the country voted for it, and I, Prime Minister, think we have to stay with that for whatever reasons. And therefore, I'm going to try and ameliorate and reduce some of the damage, but we will therefore be living with some of that damage, ongoing costs. That would be honest. That would relate to the discussion that, we're having, the European movement. He's not going to do that. So I think it fundamentally undermines our democracy not to do that.
The point is that he this is one of the things about an administrative mentality. One of the weaknesses, and I always felt this about administrators do the job they're told. Administrators are not the people that set the agenda. His background is not one of saying he's not a politician in that deeper sense. And the people, either the people around him and the people he's gone, have made a call. And this call is to make Brexit work. And the moment you start saying, well, let's ameliorate it, let's get back into the customs union, you're starting to say, well, we don't really want Brexit to work. We're trying to make the best of a bad mess. And that is not patriotic, as they understand it. That's not the Union Jack that stands there, but every time he stands and makes an official speech, is something he really embraces. He doesn't want there to be Scottish independence. He doesn't like Scotland. The less the better. They've made GB Energy, they stuck it in Scotland in order to make it clear that this is a British project. They think of Britain as a nation. I mean, Kirst is partly using that language, which I think is, but Britain is not a nation. It's a multinational entity. They're not saying we've got to have a federal, and below this, if I can just cut back to the chase, there's a crucial question which we all have to face, and especially the English. Are we a European country in terms of the meaning, in terms of our identity? That's not exclusive. We can be European and English and the Londoner, and I'm not talking in the sort of national patriotic singularity at all. But is part of our core identity, part of our core identity, that we are a European and not an arm of the greater American hegemony. And the politicians that I've met, they're all basically, they look to Washington for their ideals and Brussels for what they might call bread and butter. And that, and now Washington is no longer, is also on the move, and the world is on. We'll come to that. But the point is that this is a core issue for people. They've got to make a call. And Brexit said, well, we're going to be part of the Western alliance, great power, and therefore implicitly part of the American alliance. And we're not fundamentally a European country, but we will make deals or whatever it might be. But actually, we are not a European country.
Well, of course, the country that said that was England, right? And up to a point, Wales.
England said it like
Northern Ireland.
Said it, or rather, what I call England without London, said it.
Yes, indeed.
But and even then there were questions about. But that was a mistake, and anybody with true guts and leadership would turn around and address that mistake. It was a noble mistake. It was a democratic mistake, in my view. It was a fuck you, political elite. Look what you've done to us. If this is, it was an up yours. So it was a gutsy and brave, if foolish, decision that it can be confronted. We can be, everybody makes mistakes, and you can be proud of them. You say, all right, well, I made a mistake. I'm going to correct myself. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of in that, but they've got to confront it. And I think there is saying, oh, well, why aren't you making the best of a bad job and getting into the customs union? Misses the fundamental point that they are trapped. And to start that argument is to say, actually, Brexit was wrong. And that, of course. Then,
right. Yeah.
But it's fine you saying, of course, because you're in Scotland. And Scotland, if I can say so, is a country which, the will of the the settled will of the Scottish people is to be European.
Yes, and that's where I come in there. I mean, we've not talked much about Scotland yet, and what you're saying, it is extraordinarily fascinating, important, and disappointing. That Labour doesn't want to talk about Brexit, the Tories don't want to talk about it, apart from still claiming it's a brilliant idea, and the Lib Dems don't want to talk about Brexit. And obviously the Scottish National Party and the Scottish government perfectly happy to talk about Brexit, because first of all, they are pro-European, and also it distinguishes them from other political parties. But that just adds to this sense of disconnect that I feel, and other people in Scotland feel, between politics in Scotland and politics at Westminster. And it's worth mentioning that polls will change in the coming weeks, but we've already got polls that would give the SNP a majority if there was another general election.
I want to stop both of you for a minute. Okay, well, one point and then...
When you talk about the Lib Dems, you're right, but there's the Greens, which have done remarkably well, and there's a shift of mood. And therefore, there is the possibility at some point of an opening, maybe within many of those, for a politics, which I would call an English politics. It is an English European politics. There is a space opening up in this benighted country that I would like to be a citizen of, which is saying we can't go on like this, and we have to have a different direction.
And young people, especially in Scotland and in England, want to.
And I feel the solidarity with Scottish temper and the Scottish sort of attitude towards Europe. And I think a lot of people in England would like to see a political movement or a political party that comes to that. And that's what is missing. And perhaps Europe for Scotland in a certain way can call on us in England to act like Europeans in solidarity with Scotland.
We'll try our best. Now I want to put forward to you a question that has come from one of the many places where we are streaming the event, because I think it speaks about some of the things we have been talking about. There is Patricia Fergus that asks us, what is the message from the last general election? So do we all agree that the only reason that Labour won it was that it was a protest vote against the Tories? And I would ask you to try to answer this question, speaking from an English and a Scottish perspective, because one might argue that in the last general election, there were different messages coming from England and from Scotland in general. I'll leave it to you. What do you think about the meaning of the vote for Labour?
I think in Scotland, I would say, of course, it was an anti-Tory vote. So people voted principally for Labour and for the SNP. It was also a prioritizing of getting rid of the Tories over the SNP and independents. And so you saw that beginning of a divergence between those who support independence and those who support the SNP. And so people who support independence, a number of them voted for Labour. But even Labour politicians have said, we know we were only lent that vote. And as I just mentioned, you know, the polls are already swinging the other way, and they're neck and neck for the Scottish Parliament elections in May 2026. And so and we haven't seen the 37 Labour MPs in Scotland. We haven't seen them try and, get profile. They've given what we talked about earlier on about the gloom and doom and all the mistakes. There's been no basis for a kind of dynamic in Scotland. And so no wonder at one level the polls have shifted so fast. And just very briefly on the GB Energy that Anthony mentioned, that's already raising questions for a lot of people in Scotland about, well, yes, let's have green energy. Let's even headquarter it in Aberdeen, given the decline of the North Sea oil basin. But are we going to destroy our environment with huge pylons? Are we going to sell that electricity to England but not get any money back for it? It's raising a very important wider debate.
Yeah, I would add personally, I rather like pylons. I don't think they destroy the environment. I mean, there is a certain
they can go underground in some cases.
They can go underground. Maybe if it's more efficient. I mean, I'm not for them as such, but there are. I can see pylons from my window, and I don't object to that, and I can turn on the light, and so hopefully it comes on. Sometimes it doesn't come on, but that's not. I think here there was it was differential. There was definitely a pro-Labour vote as such. There was a deep hope among a significant number of people that Labour wasn't simply not the Tories, and it wasn't just a protest vote. And I think below that, and also in terms of the vote for the Lib Dems, there was something which was also not just as I can't remember what her name, but Patricia. It wasn't just protest, and with a very fundamental shift took place, which is that the Tories, and this was behind their version of Brexit, don't believe in government. They do believe in the market. They were still the last broken, corrupt sort of outreach of the neoliberal epoch from 1990 to 2008. And Labour does stand for and believe in government, whether it's your traditional ones like Ed Miliband or Yvette Cooper or Starmer himself or Wes Streeting. I mean, there is definitely, they want to govern properly, and they would like, I think, genuinely to govern better for people. They believe in the necessity of government. I know it sounds rather elementary. And I have a friend who worked in Downing Street as an advisor and resigned, and he made this point very strongly. They think, this is behind Boris Johnson, people should be making money, that's good, and if the government can help people make money, that's good, but they didn't really believe in government. And so I think that behind the vote, there was a very significant and powerful shift, which is catching up with the rest of the world. And we're at an epochal change in world history. And I think this has happened, one of the things that's happened, this is one of the big arguments happening in the United States. The Biden government is a government that believes in governing and has been doing so relatively successfully. And that is an important shift. And that was part of what's happening. And I think if the Tories continue by choosing a leader who looks to hating the administration and hating the way that the government as such, they won't get back into power.
I'll stop you here because you mentioned the US election. We need to start talking about that, and I will pass the baton on to Nina. One quick question, very short answer. Why is Starmer refusing to rejoin the Erasmus scheme? Is asked by a user, I don't see the name. I mean, to me, that's completely nonsense. The Erasmus scheme doesn't harm anyone. Do you think there is any sense in this refusal?
The point is this. The Erasmus scheme is run by Europe under European rules. Of course, we should be part of it, but every concession of that sort is more or less saying that Europe's got it right, and we're trying to. I think even more profound for me is, why are they letting go of the regulations over the poisoning of our food and what's going on in, our food is becoming more toxic, our beaches are toxic, the rivers are more toxic, because they're abandoning European regulation. But, if the moment that they start, this is where the Tories are undoing, do not believe in regulation or government. And is popular, regulation is popular, government popular, people need it. We all understand that the power of the market is undermining us, and we want the market kept in its place.
I think you're very eloquent, Anthony, and very to the point. But I want to also hear from Christy, and then I want to ask Nina to start the.
I should be brief. I mean, I think part of the, yes, part of what Anthony says is true. Is you start moving away from Brexit, and you not only upset the Eurosceptic media, you raise a huge debate that some of us are obviously already happening. But I think you see it with the way Yvette Cooper responded to the idea there might be a UK-EU youth mobility deal. Oh, we're not having free movement, and we're not, didn't wait to say, what does it look like? But also because of the extreme market model that has been imposed on universities, which some of whom are now teetering on the brink, some of the universities are saying, well, we can't actually cope with this. We can't cope without students from Europe or further afield paying these ridiculously high, seems to me, fees. So you're actually getting into a more problematic thing there. But obviously the migration, the tough on the border, the tough on the gangs line of Starmer, it's again, you'd think you were running into an election now, not out of an election. They are so scared still of the of the right and of losing their English Tory voters.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Thank you so much, Anthony. So I'm going to disappear and let Nina join us back. So see you in a bit.
You're muted, Nina.
No, you're still muted. There you go.
I guess it's been a while since COVID, so that's good. No longer practiced in using these online platforms. Once again, hello. And I'm, as I said earlier at the beginning, I'm Nina, the other coordinator of Europe for Scotland. And I wanted to segue to the US elections because, of course, we were talking about this year being the year of elections in the world. The majority of citizens were voting. Also, EU elections took place. And but of course, for us, in a way, still the most significant elections are taking place in 33 days in America. And it has been an absolute turbulent campaign. I don't think I need to recap the major moments. Everybody will know the debate that happened at the end of June between Biden and Trump that then precipitated Biden stepping aside as a candidate a month later. On July 21st, Kamala Harris, now the candidate. And thankfully, since then, the polls have tightened. We can hope that Trump, it seemed almost a certainty that another Trump presidency was coming our way. And of course, now it looks, like a toss-up, which is shocking too, because, I mean, the idea that a fascist could be in charge of the most powerful nation on this planet beginning in January what would be the consequences for Europe? What would be the consequences for all of us? Of course, the wars that are taking place. Anthony has written extensively about the US, about Trumpism. And I recall a few years ago, a book of you, which was called Taking Control, where you were giving a lot of praise to Biden for the way that he's been running the country. You were very pleasantly surprised, and you were wondering what will happen with Trumpism next. So what are your thoughts now?
Thank you, Yasmin. Well, a thing that surprised me and led to my writing that book is that Biden did something which in a way you could say is the exact opposite of what Starmer has set out to do, which is he opened up the center to the left. It was quite a controlled fashion, but he thanked Bernie Sanders. The Democratic program was written with Bernie Sanders in the run-up to the 2020 election. And the shift, Biden, who was a politician from the neoliberal era, was so old, like me, I mean, he's 2 weeks older than me, that he actually, his roots were in the pre-neoliberal period. He had an understanding of what more traditional social democratic politics was about. And he went back to something which was more or less his comfort, a certain degree of comfort zone of being pro-trade union and pro-government. And that alliance then created a popular movement from below, which gave him an 8 million popular majority over Trump, and a very, very slender one in terms of the, we were just talking about how grotesque the first past the post system is here, but the Electoral College is the equivalent of a first past the post system in the United States, enormously benefiting the smaller white or predominantly white states in the US. And so Biden won by very slenderly, but he did win, and it was based on the legitimacy of his enormous popular majority. And now, I think what you refer to by talking about Trump's will be a much more right wing, openly right wing, nakedly right government if Trump gets in. And I feel it's a kind of, I don't know how Kirsty, but I feel we're at an epochal moment. And the most dramatic way I could put it is, for me, it feels my whole life, my political life, is at stake in what is happening, which goes back, being 1968 to the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was this division, which then emerged in the 60s. On the one hand, there was a kind of macho, rule-breaking, apparently emancipating aspect to it, which also linked in to the genocidal, 2 million Vietnamese died, the genocidal nature of American power. And Trump he was dated from, and he represents the dark side of the 60s. And emerging out of the 60s, there was the second wave of feminism, which was within the left against the macho and the patriarchal nature of the so-called revolutionary movement. And the feminism which came out was the greatest contribution, in my view, of the 60s. And Kamala, politically, I think in a way she's to the right of Biden, but culturally, she represents a very profound move towards what you might call the left. I'm not sure whether that's the right term politically, but it's a progressive. And this is going to be a fight to the death. And if Kamala comes in, then she will be up against Xi and Putin and Modi, and you can imagine how they will feel if Xi is the president of the United States. They will be appalled. And Trump, on the other hand, is a kind of wild character, but on the other hand, he feeds their love of power and their centralization. So on a world scale, we're looking at a very decisive shift. It's linked to the ending of American hegemony and how the American hegemony will come to an end. Will it come to an end by becoming a fortress Trump, or will it come to a more, in some ways, more familiar a relatively progressive America which will wrestle with these issues. I'm not saying that Kamala's victory will produce a wonderful and benevolent United States. Certainly, I don't think that's going to be the case in the Middle East. But my goodness me, the alternative is really, really grim.
Yeah, I mean, I also think in just the snowball effect. I mean, I think in America, and rightly so, they are talking a lot about Roe versus Wade and all this, the impact on American citizens, of course, in terms of the election. But the elections, of course, will change a lot what happens in the world. And to some extent, I feel both candidates have not talked much about Europe. And of course, Biden, for instance, had strongly identifies with his Irish roots. So he arguably had a clear perspective also on Europe and on the UK and Brexit and all of these things. I feel that it is reasonable to expect that Harris would potentially be less involved than previous American administrations in European affairs, but of course more maintaining the status quo. And I found it very interesting the other day, we saw a new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And the reason why he was selected is because he's one of the few people that gets on with Trump. So it's kind of this question that I wanted to ask Kirsty. We have Viktor Orban, we have Giorgia Meloni, we have people in Europe that some of them are already making trouble, like Orban, others like Meloni are playing along. But what do you think, a Trump presidency, how would that impact European politics and also politics in the UK?
I think, I think one of the points that's clear is that so many of these different issues and challenges, they interconnect. So, if there's a Trump victory, then that's going to undermine further American democracy, because this is a far-right populism, and it's not the same as what the Tories and Boris Johnson and others did in the UK, but it certainly overlaps, and there are similarities. And we've been talking about both the institutional and the process quality of democracy across the UK, by which I mean especially at Westminster, and in that sense in England. And then, of course, we look at the European Parliament elections, and everybody to some extent breathed a sigh of relief and said, oh, well, the centre still holds. We lost very disappointingly a lot of Green MEPs, and the far right did go up, but perhaps not as much as some feared. But then we've seen the recent Austrian elections, the others, as you mentioned. So I think, we could talk, as we touched on earlier, and as Anthony touched on, for, why did people vote for Brexit? Because the elites were creating such a mess of things. But that shift to the far right at a moment when US and Western hegemony is falling, and when we have such big crises, the war in Ukraine, the genocidal destruction of Gaza, now the wider Middle East, and quite rightly that we saw, South Africa take the genocide case. So the global South is there, and is there in many positive ways. So I think we also have to be careful we don't have this conversation in an old-fashioned way, let me say, for what, of Europe, America, and the Western alliance. That's fracturing anyway. But I mean, yes, in terms of trying to manage the climate challenge, the geopolitics, the Middle East problems, the migration issues, are as neuralgic, and the US is here when actually, in Europe, including the UK, in that you've got real demographic challenges. So I think these sort of democratic and substantive political issues all interconnect. And yeah, it's going to be terribly damaging for American democracy. It's going to be damaging for stability, or for trying to solve the instability in the world. And it's going to be damaging on the crucial climate and biodiversity crises. And that's not going to help Europe to sort out its problems. And the centre-right in Europe, which is becoming one of the problems in Europe, you know, it's all very well to say the centre's holding, but that's not great if they're becoming a climate skeptic centre-right. So, sorry, I was a bit rushing through a lot of different issues, but I think these all do have knock-on effects.
Can I just reinforce that? Because I think Kirsty's point, emphasis on the climate aspect is very, and the environmental aspect is very, very important and very well taken. Trump is in effect a form of climate denier, and is, if his general thing of, you know, sort of, you know, that we've got to oil, and his embrace, his open embrace of oil money, you know, the planet will burn. And that is sort of overwhelming catastrophe, and I agree that needs that perhaps needs more emphasis than anything else. And the other point, which is a very interesting one, about not thinking of it in terms of the America and the West, about a possible Kamala Harris presidency, is that she, you know, does openly just talk about her Indian mother, and she had a Jamaican father, although he left the family when she was 5, and so there is a certain sense in which she is, if Biden felt close to Europe because he had, quote, Irish ancestry at some point or other, she actually is potentially at home in the global South in a way that you know, other politicians are not, and no other American politician has ever been. I mean, it's true, Obama had a Kenyan father, but he actually never knew his Kenyan father at all, so it wasn't really part of his direct experience or heritage. And the worrying aspect is how this will relate to what Kirsty is right, I will endorse, of saying the genocide in Gaza, because the American system is so penetrated by and geared to support for Israel that it's very difficult to see a positive outcome that's going to take place there. And the big worry now, as we speak, is we are all living in the hands of what Netanyahu and his other crazies decide. And if they decide to escalate in Iran, where they've said they will, and if they do, if they burn Iran's oil fields and Iran torches the oil fields of the Middle East, then it's not just that the price of petrol will go up, but the economic and political effects are going to be very, you know, will start to go out of control. And he may then use that opportunity to turn savagely on even more savagely on the Palestinians. So we're in a really, really dangerous situation at the moment. And I
think it's maybe you'll agree, Anthony, but I think, you know, the idea that America couldn't have reined Netanyahu in, you know, they chose in the end. Biden chose not to. I think it's not that he was out of control. It wasn't a black and white between all weapons to keep destroying and now Lebanon too. You know, it was a huge, powerful tool that they chose not to use, and maybe Kamala Harris will choose differently, but it's got, you know, that's another 4 months away, even if she wins.
Yes. Well, I hope that she does, and I hope she wins. But it doesn't look good, I have to say. I mean, you know, and the risk is that it will go completely out of control. And the you know, each side is sort of escalating a little bit more, and the savagery with which they've gone into the Lebanon and bombing the center of Beirut, and and then this is also generating political support for Netanyahu in Israel, so he feels justified in doing that.
Netanyahu is extremely well tuned into the American political situation, and everything he does is with an eye to what's going on in the US.
Yeah.
And he knows that, I think he timed this invasion into Lebanon very cleverly, in the sense that, yeah, he knows that Kamala Harris cannot really say anything now. So it's
a very question which I've been debating with other people. Do you think Netanyahu wants a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency? I mean, the argument is, if it was the Trump presidency, you can't really predict this guy. And if the Saudis offer Trump $10 billion, he would chuck Israel aside and say, well, I'm going to go with the Saudis. I mean, you know, is he reliable if he wants to start? And if he's backing Putin to the hilt, and Putin's got compromise on him, which he obviously has, and now they're bombing Russian bases in Syria. So, you know, maybe... And
Russia just told its citizens to leave Israel today, I gather. So.
Sorry?
Russia told its citizens to leave Israel, I think I saw earlier.
Oh, well, there you go, you see. So, I mean, the point is, say maybe that Harris is a safer option. Dreadful.
That's interesting, because I guess also his first administration, he was still planning to be a two-term president, and now it's all that's coming off in a sense, because he cannot be a candidate. If he was elected, he cannot be a candidate again in 4 years' time. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, he is extremely corrupt. And in that sense, yeah, I suppose I do know that his Israel policy was very much informed also by his catering to evangelicals, because they believe that that all the Jews need to return to Israel and then be converted to Christianity in order for Jesus to return. So something like the rapture.
When Trump stood up at that event in Washington and said talked about the Jews should not be voting for Democrat, because so many Jews are relatively speaking progressive, and sort of, you know, well, why are 60% of the Jews voting? The way he talked about them, like, if you felt, oh my goodness me, I'm not sure, he might just say, right, well, they didn't vote for me, the evangelicals have, but I'm not going. I mean, it's really quite wild. But it's just that what if Netanyahu? Sorry, this is just it's a rather grim sort of thing to be talking about. But if Netanyahu decides he would prefer long term to have Harris in, will that ameliorate what he does or not? Will it have any effect on him? Or is he now in a situation where the inner logic of keeping his own far right cabinet going and of just, you know, continuing to strike is something that he's really not that concerned about the United States, and thinks this is a moment, the more he escalates, the greater the opportunity to be able to have a real second Nakba and just sweep the Palestinians from the biblical lands. You know,
I mean, he's currently, you know, he's not being reined in. They're bombing in all directions in the Middle East. It's kind of out of control, and yeah, you know, to the extent there's, in a sense, a bit of a vacuum, of course, now down to the US elections. He's definitely making the most of that, and I think this is changing the subject a little bit. Obviously, the UK has carried on supplying under Starmer. You know, there was that very small cut in weapons to Israel, but not what we need. And we'll expect to hear, you know, whoever wins, but especially if Harris wins, we'll hear Starmer talking about that great transatlantic bridge and special relationship. But of course, you know, the UK with Brexit is outside the EU. It can't influence the EU in the way it used to. I think on Gaza, that's fortunate. You know, it's actually better that there are splits in the EU on Gaza, with countries like Spain and Ireland and Belgium and others being good, you know, and von der Leyen busy, well, very in line with the German position, in fact. But I think, you know, so that Britain on the sidelines, even with a more reasonable, rational Starmer that the EU leaders can get on with better, is yeah, and a UK more in the back seat, whatever happens. And obviously then Scotland has its own little offices in some of the EU capitals, but it's for the moment it's part of that.
But under the
relatively silent,
wasn't it? I mean, do you feel Scotland can do anything in terms of of support for the Palestinians? Has Scotland recognised Palestine as a state? Is it able to do so?
I think I'm not sure on that, I'm afraid. But I mean, I think with Humza Yousaf as First Minister, you know, Scotland and the Scottish government put Scotland in a very good and moral and the right political position from the start. And, you know, we've not really talked about, in terms of the election, why people were also fed up with the SNP, a very difficult year and a half, and Nicola Sturgeon resigning, all the other issues going on, right down to more local national issues like ferry problems. But I think for a lot of people who did vote for the SNP, it wasn't only about independence. It was, you know, on the one hand, Humza Yousaf actually taking the right international and diplomatic role on that, as you could say the same about Sadiq Khan in a different context in London. And also, I think, you know, we touched briefly on GB Energy earlier, and we're saying climate's very important in terms of the American elections. But that decision by Keir Starmer to dump the 28 billion a year climate pledge, you know, for me at least, that was a moment of taking away hope and reneging on a crucial thing. And so again, when one's looking at, you know, there were some questions I think being put up for this event about how should they run the elections into 2026. But I think talking about the European side, definitely.
It's great that you mentioned the questions, because there is a tons of questions that are, we want to run them because a lot of people are asking them. Just want to make a quick point. From my Italian perspective, Scotland rejoining the EU would be fantastic precisely for its foreign policy, its diplomacy of humanity, as we put it in a newsletter a few years ago. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, is that I want Scotland to help the EU get a better stance. So let's get on with the questions. We have a very good couple of questions from Mike that correctly asks that we should discuss also the American electoral system, because if the first past the post is dysfunctional, probably so is the electoral college. And perhaps your thoughts on that would be interesting. And also, if Trump does win, how does that impact on the chances of reform and Farage in the UK? This is a worry that many people share. And also, finally, but I think we all agree on that. Do we all agree that Trump would be bad and we don't want Trump to win? I think that's a resolute yes for all of us. But over to you for this couple of questions.
I mean, I did talk a little bit about the Electoral College. The American system is rigged, and the Supreme Court decision that the president can basically, whatever the president officially states is law, is a very dangerous one, not just because of the constitutional aspect, but because one thing which I've written about, which is very little discussed, is that the American surveillance state is absolutely massive. That everybody's emails and electronic records and so on are stored. They're stored nominally in order to be able to discover any terrorist threats. But under the new ruling of the Supreme Court, a Trump president could in fact, you know, demand to know anything about anybody directly. And so you're moving towards a kind of Chinese surveillance system. And that's one of the reasons why a Trump presidency would be, and a Trump then reinforcing the Supreme Court, does offer, and I think Nina was right at the right beginning, of sort of fascist. It's not fascist in the traditional sense, but it would be a regime determined never to be defeated again and willing to use the existing administrative executive system in order to ensure that it was no longer subject to a fair democratic judgment. And that is very, very dangerous. So the Electoral College could open that out because it is so bad. But if Trump gets back in, then they won't even be relying on the Electoral College to ensure that this becomes a reversible outcome.
I think that's right. And you know what we saw with Trump refusing to accept the last election and encouraging insurrection and the attack on the Capitol, you know, is you know, huge and fundamental moment. And Biden won, but America's political system is not, or the quality of its democracy, the stability of its democracy is not recovered from that. I think on the question on reform, it was what I was saying briefly earlier, you know, a victory for the far right, as in Trump in the States, is definitely an encouragement for the far right in Europe. In the UK, I mean, reform has not been very important in Scotland up till now, but actually it's polling higher than it was before, not as high as in England. And it looks like under our actually much fairer proportional representation system for the Scottish Parliament, it looks like it could get for the first time some members of the Scottish Parliament seats in 2026. And if that's true, and I mean, it's gone up, it could go, I hope, back down again. But if that's true, and if the SNP and Labour turn out to be neck and neck, you know, it may be actually quite difficult to form a governing coalition in Scotland in 2026, unless Labour's going to either do a deal with the SNP, seems unlikely, or with the Tories as well as the Lib Dems. Now, we're a way off that yet. But before, you know, a couple of months ago, I'd said, oh, reform, that's Anthony to talk about that, because that's England, not Scotland. But actually now we have to start factoring it in.
What is support are they getting in the polls at the moment?
I think there was one where they'd gone up to 7 and one where they'd maybe gone up to 11%. So it's just getting high enough to win a few seats on our list system.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope not, but there you go. Right. There is a comment reminding us that Humza Yousaf wrote to Rishi Sunak calling for the UK to officially recognize the state of Palestine, which I think it's very important to remember. There is also another comment that reminds us all that turnout in Scotland for the Scottish independence referendum was much higher, both of the Brexit referendum and, of course, of the latest general election. And we hope that will remain the case, that democracy in Scotland remains stronger and more participated. There is also a question about the impact on the situation in the EU, emphasizing that Macron is thinking that there might be problems down the line, and we saw with Orban, people are worried also about Meloni. I'm not as worried about Meloni as I am about Orban, being Italian. But yeah, I don't know. If you want just to give a very quick overview, because we just want to reply all the comments.
What about the far right in Germany? Maybe Nina can tell us something about, because that does seem to be a very significant political shift taking place there, and one which is very difficult to understand.
You're putting me on the spot.
Yes.
I do feel, yeah, it's utterly shocking that the AfD is doing so well. And perhaps the thing that concerns me the most is the demographics of the people voting for the AfD. Because I feel one thing that is often encouraging when you look at otherwise disappointing electoral results elsewhere is that young people are voting progressive and old people not so much. And then you think, okay, the future might be better. It's the opposite with the AfD vote in Germany. It's young people voting for them. And it's only thanks to older voters that in the recent Brandenburg election was won by the SPD. So I think, yeah, it's a complicated situation overall. There's still a majority of people appalled by the AfD and by the thought that such a far-right party could be elected in Germany. And in that sense, Germany is in a very different situation than Austria. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really want to predict the future there. I feel that East Germany and West Germany, yet today we are celebrating the union of the two. But in many ways, there is still quite a rift in terms of how the past is seen, and also how people just feel as second-class citizens now in the East, and therefore feel, you know, want to change the status quo. And I was thinking about that. You said that earlier, Anthony. You said the status quo is the greatest danger we have. And I think with regard to Germany, I would say those people that are feeling like that, unfortunately, they vote for the AfD.
I mean, I think on the turnout questions, the EU and independence and so on, there was, you know, obviously because, you know, you were aiming, as you said at the start, to do this event 10 years after the 2014 independence referendum, and there were various polls, as you'd expect at the time, that some of them showed sort of, I think the YouGov poll maybe had support for yes, down to about 45%. Other polls had it higher, but if you look at the run of polls, it's close to 50-50, but the demographics are very, very strong. And so at least 2/3 of voters under 35 support independence. And very interestingly, and given the context of our discussion and your whole raison d'etre, if you ask them, as the YouGov poll did, you know, would you support independence in the EU? The numbers go up to 56%, and I think it's only the over 65s who still say no. Before we get too enthusiastic about that, then you have to look at other work John Curtis, the great polling guru, did recently, and he delves into that a bit more. Well, would you want to independence in the EU if it puts a customs barrier between England and Scotland, if you have to show your passport? So actually proper substantive democracy, getting into the discussion of the details, matters. But we have actually, and we continue to be able to do that, I would say, in Scotland.
I guess that connects very well to
all I can say.
Yeah. The very last couple of questions are precisely about advice that you would give to the SNP for campaigning in the 2026 Holyrood election. And I think
SNP and pro-EU parties, not just SNP.
Yes, correct. The Green Party as well. And what would you suggest to them to beat Labour? And particularly, would you suggest to highlight the commitment to rejoin the EU in the campaign? This is us from Morag, from Yes for You. So well, I think I know
I
what
would like to answer. I know that Kirsty should be the person to really answer that, but I will, from outside, want to lobby in one point in particular, which is that my feeling, growing feeling it was, going to Scotland, I was there for the referendum, which I was hoping and I wanted a yes vote to win, is this, that I think that after the referendum, there was this enormous wave of support and people joining the SNP. And there was a sense that something, despite the defeat, something very profound had happened in the enormous rise from, you know, being seen as what Cameron thought was a 30%, clear minority destined to irrelevance, to becoming a historic grouping that could possibly, you know, take Scotland into independence. And I felt that the SNP then, under Nicola Sturgeon, as well as in a different way under Salmond, had imported into Scotland the Westminster model of politics: centralised, controlling, party politics, not releasing energy, centralising in that cultural sense as well as an organisational sense. And that this explosion of energy did not, you know, there wasn't sort of movements in different towns, and they weren't allowing, they didn't encourage voice, they didn't encourage citizens' assemblies, there are all sorts of ways in which a different kind of democracy could have been associated with independence. And I think that was a great failure. That was my feeling. And I think that, I won't give this as advice, it's not my position to advise people like that, but I feel that what I'm looking for and would like to see is a much more democratic politics in terms of not being nearly so parliamentary, so party political, so centralized, and making politics relevant and releasing those energies in terms of people's bodies and how they feel. And taking those risks, and the whole nature of party politics is to control and to limit that.
I understand what you're saying, Anthony. I don't disagree with all of it, although, you know, I should say I was giving a talk last week to the Yes for Yes and the EU. Sorry, I'm forgetting its name.
Yes for the EU.
Well, forgive me, but the Yes group in Dunbar last week on EU accession and an independent Scotland joining the EU, and there are plenty of these, local and grassroots groups. And I think, I mean, it's very interesting. In 2016, after the Brexit vote, there was, if you look back, you'll see there was a vote in the Scottish Parliament that said, we think Scotland should either stay in the EU or at the very least in its single market. And that was voted for across the board, except the Tories, and the Tories abstained. They didn't even vote against. And Labour and the Lib Dems voted for. And one of the non-independents politicians said to me later that felt like a moment of real possibility and real opportunity, but it kind of dissipated very fast. And you'd have to have another whole session to look at that. But I think there was just a whole different political story at that time.
I'm not saying there aren't lots of people in Scotland, small groups and civic society are active and motivated. On the contrary, as you know, I mean, we can see in terms of people like Leslie Riddoch with the Europe for Scotland that there's an enormous amount of, but I feel it's frustrated energy very often. And what I was looking for was from the government in Scotland to create and invest in state structures, local decentralizing structures, which unlock people's energy, but also give it some capacity to decide things. And
absolutely. I mean, yes, Scotland is I'm not disagreeing with you that Scotland is over centralized, and I think and there is a discussion, especially now. I mean, it's been there before, but especially now with the independence voters and the SNP vote somewhat not aligning as it used to, about how do you create a new renewed yes movement, if you like, across Scotland. I think another part of this, and we might need another session to cover all this, but I think a lot of the debate in the last 10 years around independence has been, hey, we almost did it, so when's the next referendum, and we're going to have another 6-8 week campaign and we'll get it over the line. So a lot of people, yes, campaigning in the meantime, but waiting for the campaign. And, I've talked to people in the SNP, about why aren't they doing more on Europe, and how you join the EU. And we don't want to peak too soon. And I think that's looking at it, you need to get support to 55 or 65% and keep it there. You don't need to just think about, it's not just an election, it's every stage.
This conference we had, partly celebrating Tom Nairn a year ago in Edinburgh, was that with Brexit now, it is no longer, I mean, I'm rather sort of paraphrasing him, but maybe it's because this is what I now feel, is it's no longer a question of Scotland voting against Britain in a classic kind of claim of independence, but of Scotland looking to work with the Welsh, who are now basically gifted, and with the movement in Ireland, which in a different way is seeking unification within the EU of North and South, and with potentially an England that wants to go back into Europe, but working with the other countries within what Fintan O'Toole called the archipelago to rejoin the European Union rather than simply Scotland alone. And that also involves a different cultural change of not rerunning the referendum. And I think that's a very good point.
And I think, sorry, Andre, we haven't actually answered your final two questions, so let me do that briefly, which was, should the SNP emphasize independence in the EU in the run-up to the 2026 Holyrood election? I would say definitely that, there's an ongoing debate about how do you balance being the Scottish government and dealing with the NHS and poverty and drug deaths and ferries against talking about independence. And there's always some people who say you should stop talking about independence and just show that you can govern while we're in a cost of living crisis. But I think there are always ways to connect the two, and there always should be, because otherwise, you as the SNP and the Scottish government are not doing your job, so, and I think you see Stephen Flynn, the SNP's Westminster leader, doing this to some extent. So he talks about why, you know, where we started today, this evening, you know, why is Starmer and Labour embracing a hard Brexit? Why aren't they restarting Erasmus? Why aren't they looking for a softer Brexit? And then that links to wanting independence in the EU. And of course, there are some SNP and independent supporters and Green Party supporters who may say we'd prefer to be like Norway, where we want the European Economic Area. They're a minority, but they certainly exist and they have the right to make that argument. But I don't think that it's going to help the SNP or Greens to do well in the elections to equivocate on the EU. So I think, you know, it can be a really positive, dynamizing argument. And you know, the SNP did badly in the general election. It's, you know, it's lost energy. As I said earlier, it's had, for a mixture of reasons, a difficult year or 18 months. But frankly, you know, if I was in the Scottish government or an SNP politician looking also at what we started saying this evening, at how badly Labour's managed its first 100 days, that would be giving me rather a lot of energy. Labour want to win in Scotland and in Wales at the next two elections, and it's going to upset Starmer's whole wider narrative if they don't, but it's absolutely not guaranteed in any way. It's a very open race.
Andrew, you're muted.
To end on, I you said.
I was to say I completely agree with you, Kirsty. The more Starmer speaks with dishonesty and untrustworthiness, the more the SNP should tell what they really believe, or they should be honest and open. And on that note, I want to make a small announcement coming from Independence, a big announcement coming from Independence Live, that are live streaming the event Owning Our Future, a conference, the autonomy movements in Europe, which is in Edinburgh on Saturday. And I also want to close with a note of hope, we hope, from our campaign, because in the last European elections, we tried to speak up for Scotland, as we put it, asking MEP candidates across Europe to sign a statement of solidarity with Scotland. And there were 37 of them from 11 European countries, which, despite bad news about the government in Scotland, despite the expected change in Westminster, they were ready to speak up for Scotland then. And if they were ready to speak up for Scotland then, you can imagine how ready they will be in a few years' time if a referendum is finally granted. So this is the list of names. About 10 of them are in the new parliament, so we know where to start. There is 10 people, 10 politicians, 10 European politicians ready to help Scotland when the time comes. And on this note, I would like to thank you so much, Kirsty and Anthony, for this beautiful conversation.
Good discussion.
And if you don't follow us on social media, do look for Europe for Scotland on Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and I think there are a few more that I don't remember now. So thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
We'll have another event early next year. It's going to be the 5th anniversary of Brexit, the official Brexit Day. It's already going to be 5 years in January.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
See you then.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.